All right, so November 24th, 1904, Thanksgiving Day, Stockton, California. Benjamin Holt stood in a field watching his 77,000-pound steam traction engine sink into the soft peat soil of the California Delta. Again. The wheels, despite being 8 feet tall, just disappeared into the earth like they were trying to dig the china. This was the third time that month. Holt wasn't just annoyed, he was desperate. His company, the Holt Manufacturing Company, had spent decades building these massive steam-powered machines to replace horses on farms. They worked beautifully on hard ground, but California's richest farmland, the Delta region with its deep, moisture-rich soil, turned these behemoths into expensive lawn ornaments. Farmers needed to work that land. Holt needed to sell them machines that actually worked there. The problem was simple physics. Pressure equals force divided by area. Those giant wheels concentrated 77,000 pounds onto maybe, 20 square feet of contact patch? The ground didn't stand a chance. Holt needed to spread that weight over a much larger area. But how? He'd been experimenting with an idea, a radical one. What if the machine laid its own road as it traveled, a continuous track that would distribute weight over maybe 100 square feet or more? On that Thanksgiving Day in 1904, Holt's crew attached a pair of experimental wooden tracks to a modified steam traction engine. Each track was about 3 feet wide and wrapped around the entire length of the machine. The tracks themselves were made of individual wooden slats, 2 inches thick, bolted to chains. The whole assembly it looked insane. Holt's chief mechanic, a guy named Oscar Stark, climbed into the operator's seat. The engine fired up. That distinctive huffing of a steam engine building pressure. Stark engaged the drive sprockets. The tracks began to move, laying themselves down in front of the machine and being picked up behind it in one continuous loop, and the machine moved forward. It didn't sink, it just crawled across the soft ground like some kind of massive mechanical caterpillar. Holt reportedly looked at the tracks moving, that undulating motion, and said, "Hey, it crawls just like a caterpillar." A company photographer standing nearby supposedly replied, "Caterpillar, huh? That's not a bad name for it." Whether that exact conversation happened, we don't know for sure, but by December 1904, Holt filed a patent for his traction engine, and the word caterpillar started appearing in company literature. The name stuck because, honestly, it was perfect. These machines really did crawl. Now, here's the thing. Benjamin Holt didn't invent the tracked vehicle from scratch. That credit goes to engineers in Britain and elsewhere who'd experimented with similar concepts for years. But Holt was the first to make it work at commercial scale for agriculture. He refined it. He made it reliable enough that farmers would actually buy the things and use them in real working conditions. The early Holt Caterpillar tractors sold like crazy in California. Farmers who'd struggled with wheeled tractors suddenly could work land they'd never been able to touch before. Holt's company grew fast. But here's where it gets interesting. Holt had competition. Serious competition. And that competition came from someone he knew very, very well. About 40 miles away in San Leandro, a man named Daniel Best was building his own line of steam tractors. Best was older than Holt, more established, and he'd been in the tractor business longer. His Best manufacturing company was actually larger than Holt's operation, at least initially. Best and Holt had a complicated relationship. They'd worked together in the past, even shared some business dealings, but by the early 1900s, they were rivals. Best's son, Clarence Leo Best, had actually worked for Holt before starting his own competing company called the C.L. Best Gas Traction Company in 1910. So you had Benjamin Holt in Stockton building Caterpillar tracked-type tractors, you had Daniel Best in San Leandro building wheeled tractors, and you had Clarence Best building his own tracked-type tractors that were frankly pretty similar to Holt's designs. This was shaping up to be a knockdown, drag-out business war. The market was exploding. World War I changed everything. The United States Army saw Holt's Caterpillar tractors and realized these machines could cross trenches and shell-torn battlefields where wheeled vehicles would be useless. The British and French militaries came knocking on Holt's door, desperate for anything that could move supplies across the Western Front's muddy nightmare. Holt Manufacturing ramped up production like crazy. They opened a second factory in Peoria, Illinois in 1909, specifically to be closer to Midwestern farming markets. When the war orders started flooding in, that Peoria plant became a 24-hour operation, churning out tract-type tractors as fast as humanly possible. The Holt Caterpillar tractors served as artillery tractors, supply haulers, and most famously, they inspired the development of the tank. British engineers looked at Holt's tract system and thought, hey, what if we put armor and guns on one of these? The Mark I tank, the first tank ever used in combat, borrowed heavily from Holt's tract-type design. By 1918, when the war ended, Holt Manufacturing had built more than 10,000 Caterpillar tractors. The company was riding high. Benjamin Holt was wealthy and famous. The Caterpillar track was proven technology. Everything looked great. Except the war ended. All those military contracts dried up instantly. The company had expanded to meet wartime demand, and now they had massive factories tooled for production levels that peacetime agriculture couldn't sustain. And the C.L. Best Gas Traction Company, run by Clarence Best, had also grown during the war. They'd built their own tract-type tractors, carefully designed to avoid Holt's patents, but functionally very similar. Best's tractors were good. Some farmers thought they were better than Holt's. The competition was vicious. Both companies were spending enormous amounts of money on patent lawsuits against each other. Both were fighting for the same customers. Both were struggling with the post-war economic slump. Something had to give.
So, by 1925, both companies were bleeding money. The Holt Manufacturing Company and the C.L. Best Gas Traction Company were locked in this mutual destruction pact. Patent lawyers were getting rich, while both companies watched their profits evaporate. There were other problems, too. The agricultural market was changing. Farmers were moving away from steam power toward gasoline engines. They were smaller, lighter, didn't require a water supply, and you didn't need to wait 20 minutes for them to build steam pressure before you could start working. Best's company had embraced gas engines early. Holt had been slower to adapt, still committed to their steam tractor designs. The board members at both companies started having quiet conversations. What if they just stopped fighting and merged? On April 15, 1925, the Holt Manufacturing Company and the C.L. Best Gas Traction Company officially combined to form a new corporation. They called it the Caterpillar Tractor Company. The headquarters would be in Peoria, Illinois, with manufacturing facilities there and in San Leandro, California. The merger wasn't exactly friendly. There was a lot of tension. Clarence Best had spent years competing against Benjamin Holt, and now they were supposed to be partners. But the business logic was undeniable. Combined, they controlled most of the track-type tractor market. They could pool their patents, they could eliminate redundant manufacturing, they could stop spending money suing each other and start spending it on actually building better products. Benjamin Holt didn't live to see much of the merged company's success. He died in December 1920 before the merger was finalized. But his legacy, that Caterpillar name and that track-type tractor design, became the foundation of one of the most powerful industrial companies in the world. The newly formed Caterpillar Tractor Company had one massive problem to solve immediately. Gasoline engines were better for small to medium tractors. Everyone agreed on that. But for the really big machines, the ones doing heavy earth-moving and construction work, gasoline engines had limitations. They couldn't produce enough torque at low speeds. They overheated under sustained heavy loads. They guzzled fuel. There was another engine technology emerging: diesel. Rudolf Diesel's compression ignition engine had been around since the 1890s, but it was mainly used in ships and stationary power plants. Diesel engines were heavy, expensive, and difficult to manufacture, but they had incredible advantages. Way more fuel efficient than gasoline, massive low-end torque, could run all day under full load without overheating. In 1931, Caterpillar made the decision that would define the company for the next 90 years. They went all in on diesel. The first Caterpillar diesel tractor, the Diesel 60, launched in the absolute depths of the Great Depression. Terrible timing, right? The economy was collapsing, farmers and contractors were going bankrupt. Who was going to buy expensive new diesel tractors? Turns out, people who were barely surviving. See, diesel fuel was cheaper than gasoline, way cheaper, and diesel engines used about half as much fuel to do the same amount of work. If you were a contractor trying to keep your business alive during the Depression, and you had to choose between a gasoline tractor that burned through expensive fuel or a diesel tractor that would pay itself in fuel savings within a couple years, the math was pretty clear. The Diesel 60 wasn't perfect. Early models had reliability issues. Starting a diesel engine in cold weather was a nightmare. You basically had to heat the thing with blowtorches sometimes to get it to turn over. But Caterpillar's engineers worked through the problems methodically, improving the design year after year. By the mid-1930s, Caterpillar had an entire line of diesel tractors: the Cat 22, the Cat 30, the Cat 35, the Cat 50. They dominated construction sites and large-scale farming operations. Competitors like International Harvester and Alice Challenger tried to keep up, but Caterpillar had a head start in diesel technology, and they never really lost it. The company's product line expanded beyond just track-type tractors. They started building motor graders for road construction. They built bulldozer blades that attached to the front of tractors. They acquired companies that made cables and control systems. By 1940, if you were building a road, a dam, or an airfield anywhere in the United States, you were probably using Caterpillar equipment. And then World War II happened. And just like World War I, military demand exploded. But this time, the demand was even bigger. The United States military needed earth-moving equipment in staggering quantities. Every airfield, every military base, every defensive fortification required massive amounts of dirt to be moved. Track-type tractors were essential for jungle warfare in the Pacific, where wheeled vehicles were useless in the mud and dense vegetation. Cat bulldozers were used to build roads, clear landing zones, construct bunkers, bury mines, and 1,000 other tasks. The famous Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, ran almost exclusively on Caterpillar equipment. They'd hit a Pacific island, and within days they'd have a functional airstrip carved out of the jungle using Cat bulldozers working around the clock. The Caterpillar company's production during the war was absolutely insane. The Peoria plant operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the entire duration of the war. The company built more than 50,000 track-type tractors between 1941 and 1945. They also built diesel engines for tanks, for landing craft, for generator sets, for just about anything the military needed powered. The war transformed Caterpillar from a large agricultural and construction equipment company into an industrial giant. The company's wartime production established relationships with military procurement that would last for decades. More importantly, soldiers and Seabees who'd used Cat equipment during the war came home with strong opinions about which brands were reliable. When they became contractors and farmers in the post-war boom, they remembered which equipment had kept working in New Guinea and Okinawa and Normandy. The post-war era was boom time. The United States embarked on the largest infrastructure building spree in human history. The interstate highway system, suburban expansion, dam construction, airports, shopping malls, housing developments, all of it required massive earth moving, and Caterpillar was positioned perfectly to supply the equipment. The company's product line exploded. They didn't just make tractors anymore. They made scrapers, excavators, off-highway trucks, wheel loaders, backhoes, compactors, pipe layers, and motor graders. The iconic Caterpillar yellow color became so ubiquitous on construction sites that people just called the machines Cats, regardless of whether they were actually made by Caterpillar or a competitor. In 1950, Caterpillar Tractor Company officially renamed itself, well, it stayed Caterpillar Tractor Company until 1986, actually, but everyone just called it Caterpillar or Cat. The company went public in 1929, and by the 1950s, it was one of the most valuable industrial companies on the stock market.
By 1960, Caterpillar basically owned the earth-moving equipment market in the United States. Their market share was somewhere around 50%. No other company came close. International Harvester tried, Alice Chalmers tried, John Deere eventually got into the game, but Caterpillar had advantages that were really hard to overcome. First, they had the dealer network. Caterpillar invested heavily in establishing exclusive dealerships across the country, dealerships that didn't just sell equipment, but maintained huge parts inventories and employed highly trained mechanics. If your Cat bulldozer broke down on a job site at 2 in the morning, you could call the dealer and they'd have a service truck with parts on site by sunrise. That level of support was unmatched. Second, they had scale. Caterpillar's factories were enormous, highly automated for the era, and incredibly efficient. They could manufacture equipment cheaper than competitors while maintaining higher quality standards. Their diesel engines were legendary for durability. Stories circulated about Cat engines running for 30,000 hours, 50,000 hours, sometimes more without major overhauls. But success like that attracts attention, and in the 1960s, attention came from Japan. Komatsu Limited, a Japanese company that had been building mining equipment since the 1920s, decided they wanted a piece of the global construction equipment market. They'd spent the 1950s rebuilding after World War II, and by the 1960s, they were ready to go on the offensive. Komatsu had advantages. Japanese manufacturing was becoming incredibly efficient. Labor costs were lower, the Japanese government supported export industries with favorable financing, and Komatsu was willing to undercut Caterpillar on price, sometimes substantially. Initially, Caterpillar didn't take Komatsu seriously. The prevailing attitude was kind of dismissive. Japanese equipment was seen as cheap imitations of American designs. That attitude would prove to be a massive strategic mistake. Through the 1970s, Komatsu ate into Caterpillar's market share relentlessly. They started in developing markets, where price mattered more than brand loyalty. Then they moved into Europe. Then they started winning contracts in the United States, especially with customers who were more sensitive to upfront purchase price, long-term support, and durability. By 1980, Komatsu was a legitimate threat. They weren't just competing on price anymore. Their equipment quality had improved dramatically. Some of their designs were actually more innovative than Caterpillar's. They adopted hydraulic systems faster. Their cabs were more comfortable. Their fuel efficiency was better in some models. Caterpillar's response was complicated. The company had grown bureaucratic. Decision-making was slow. Product development cycles took forever. The engineering culture that had driven the company's early success had been replaced by a more conservative, risk-averse approach. Then came the early 1980s recession, which absolutely hammered the construction equipment industry. Interest rates went through the roof, construction activity collapsed, and demand for earth-moving equipment fell off a cliff. Caterpillar's sales dropped by more than half between 1981 and 1983. The company posted its first annual loss since the 1930s. Caterpillar responded with massive layoffs. Thousands of workers lost their jobs. Plants were closed, R&D budgets were slashed. It was brutal. The unions were furious. The UAW represented Caterpillar's factory workers, and they watched the company cut blue-collar jobs while executive compensation stayed high. Trust between management and labor evaporated. Through the 1980s, Caterpillar restructured aggressively. They modernized factories. They pushed dealers to improve service. They finally started taking Komatsu seriously as a competitor, matching them on technology and sometimes undercutting them on price. The company's financial performance stabilized, then improved. But the labor relations never really healed, and in 1991, it all blew up. The UAW contract expired. Negotiations broke down. On November 4th, 1991, 12,000 Caterpillar workers went on strike. The strike was ugly. The UAW wanted job security guarantees, better wages, and improvements to healthcare. Management wanted more flexibility to hire and fire, to move production between plants, and to implement work rule changes that would improve productivity. The strike lasted 5 months. Neither side would budge. Caterpillar threatened to hire permanent replacement workers. The UAW countered that replacing skilled workers wasn't as easy as management thought. Quality would suffer. Dealer relations would be damaged. Finally, in April 1992, the UAW called off the strike without winning a contract. Workers went back to their jobs under the expired contract terms, essentially a total defeat for the union. It was the first time in decades that a major American union had lost a strike that completely. But the bitterness didn't go away. In 1994, the UAW struck again. This time, Caterpillar actually did hire permanent replacement workers. Production continued, though quality problems definitely increased. The strike lasted 17 months, the longest major strike in the U.S. during the 1990s. The UAW finally settled in 1998, agreeing to a contract that gave Caterpillar most of what they'd wanted in terms of work rule flexibility. The union got modest wage increases and healthcare improvements, but they'd lost the job security protections they'd fought for. The strikes left deep scars. Caterpillar had proven they could win a war of attrition against their own workers, but the human cost was enormous. Families were torn apart, workers lost their homes, communities that depended on Caterpillar plants were devastated. From a pure business perspective, though, Caterpillar emerged stronger. They'd restructured their operations, implemented lean manufacturing techniques, and regained ground against Komatsu. By 2000, Caterpillar was back on top of the global earth-moving equipment market.
The 2000s brought a construction boom like the world had never seen. China was urbanizing at an unprecedented pace, building entire cities from scratch. India was modernizing its infrastructure. The Middle East was constructing mega projects. Even in the United States, despite periodic recessions, there was steady demand for earth-moving equipment. Caterpillar rode that wave to record profits. The company diversified beyond just construction equipment. They became a major player in mining equipment, building massive haul trucks that could carry 400 tons of ore. They expanded their engines business, selling diesel and natural gas engines for marine applications, power generation, locomotives, and industrial uses. In 2010, Caterpillar's annual revenue exceeded $40 billion. They employed more than 100,000 people worldwide. They had dealers in more than 180 countries. They were the largest manufacturer of construction and mining equipment on Earth, with roughly twice the market share of their closest competitor. But that success came with complications. Caterpillar had become a truly global company, with manufacturing facilities on every continent except Antarctica. They sourced parts from thousands of suppliers worldwide. They sold equipment to customers ranging from small contractors to national governments to multinational mining companies. Managing that complexity was incredibly difficult. The 2008 financial crisis showed just how vulnerable global supply chains could be. When credit markets froze, construction projects stopped dead. Customers who'd ordered equipment canceled their orders. Dealers who'd stocked up on inventory got stuck with machines they couldn't sell. Caterpillar's sales dropped by more than 30% in 2009. The company responded with more layoffs, more plant closures, and more cost-cutting. It was the same playbook they'd used in the early 1980s and early 1990s. Brutal, but effective. By 2010, demand had recovered, and Caterpillar was profitable again. The company also faced growing pressure around environmental regulations. Diesel engines, which had been Caterpillar's core technology for 80 decades, were increasingly seen as polluters. The European Union implemented stringent emission standards. California pushed for even tighter rules. The EPA kept ratcheting up requirements for particulate matter and nitrogen oxide emissions. Caterpillar invested billions in developing cleaner diesel technology. Selective catalytic reduction, diesel particulate filters, advanced fuel injection systems, all designed to make diesel engines meet the new standards while maintaining power and fuel efficiency. They succeeded, mostly, but it added cost and complexity to every machine. At the same time, there was growing interest in alternative power systems. Electric and hybrid construction equipment started appearing, especially for smaller machines, operating in urban areas where noise and emissions mattered. Caterpillar experimented with these technologies but remained committed to diesel for their heavy equipment line. Their strategy was pragmatic. Electric power works great for a small excavator working in a city. It doesn't work so well for a mining truck hauling 400 tons up a mountain in the Australian outback. Diesel would remain the dominant power source for heavy equipment for the foreseeable future, but Caterpillar needed to keep developing alternatives for specific applications. One of Caterpillar's biggest strategic moves in the 2000s was acquiring other companies to expand their product portfolio. They bought companies that made underground mining equipment. They bought companies that made forestry equipment. They bought companies that made tunnel boring machines. Each acquisition brought new technology, new customers, and new challenges. The company also invested heavily in technology, though perhaps not as heavily as they should have. Autonomous mining trucks, GPS-guided grading systems, telematics that allow remote monitoring of equipment health. These were all areas where Caterpillar was playing catch-up to competitors and to tech companies entering the construction space. By 2015, Caterpillar faced a new kind of competition, not from traditional rivals like Komatsu or Volvo, but from technology companies that saw construction as ripe for disruption. Silicon Valley startups talked about using drones for site surveying, using AI for equipment optimization, using robotics to replace human operators. Some of it was hype, some of it was real. Caterpillar's response was to double down on what they did best, building durable, powerful, reliable machines backed by an unmatched dealer and service network. They argued that construction wasn't like software. You couldn't just disrupt it with an app. You needed machines that worked in extreme conditions. You needed dealers who could get parts to remote job sites. You needed mechanics who understood diesel engines and hydraulic systems. They were probably right. A decade later, most of those Silicon Valley construction startups had failed or been acquired. The fundamentals of moving dirt hadn't changed that much. You still needed big machines operated by skilled people. But Caterpillar also incorporated new technology where it made sense. Their latest machines have sophisticated electronics, cameras that eliminate blind spots, systems that prevent the machine from hitting obstacles or tipping over. They developed Cat Connect, a suite of digital tools that helps contractors manage their equipment fleets more efficiently. The company's financial performance through the 2010s was strong but uneven. When commodity prices were high, mining companies bought equipment and Caterpillar's profits soared. When commodity prices crashed, as they did in 2015 and 2016, mining equipment sales collapsed and Caterpillar struggled. The cyclical nature of their business was just a reality they had to manage. In 2017, Caterpillar Incorporated, they'd changed the name in 1986 to reflect their diversification beyond just tractors, announced something remarkable. For the first time in their 92-year history, they were going to move their global headquarters. They'd been in Peoria, Illinois since the 1926 merger, but they were moving to Chicago. The official reason was to be closer to customers, closer to talent, closer to global transportation hubs. The unofficial reason was probably that Peoria, while still home to major manufacturing facilities, was no longer the center of a global industrial empire. Chicago made more sense for a company doing business in 180 countries. The move was controversial. Peoria had built its identity around Caterpillar. The company employed thousands of people in the area. Moving the headquarters to Chicago felt like a betrayal to some long-term employees and community members. But Caterpillar was a different company than it had been in 1925. It wasn't a Midwestern tractor manufacturer anymore. It was a global industrial conglomerate competing against rivals from Japan, Sweden, Germany, China, and Korea. Sentimentality was a luxury they couldn't always afford.
So where does that bring us today? Caterpillar Incorporated in 2025 is one of the most valuable industrial companies in the world, with annual revenue approaching $60 billion and a market capitalization over $150 billion. They employ around 110,000 people. They manufacture equipment in dozens of countries and sell through a dealer network of about 160 independent dealers operating more than 1,800 locations worldwide. That dealer network remains Caterpillar's greatest competitive advantage. Other companies can build good bulldozers and excavators, but matching Caterpillar's parts availability, their service capabilities, their financing options, their operator training programs, that's almost impossible for a competitor to replicate. The product line has expanded to hundreds of different machines. Track-type tractors, the original product that started it all, are now just one category. There are wheel loaders, hydraulic excavators, articulated trucks, motor graders, compactors, cold planers, pavers, skid steer loaders, backhoe loaders, and dozens of specialized machines for mining, forestry, and material handling. The company's engines business has become massive in its own right.
Caterpillar diesel and natural gas engines power ships, trains, generators, oil and gas drilling rigs, industrial facilities, and even some military vehicles. When a hurricane knocks out power, hospitals and emergency services often rely on Cat generator sets to keep running. But Caterpillar faces challenges that would have been unimaginable to Benjamin Holt back in 1904. Climate change and the push toward decarbonization threaten the long-term viability of diesel engines. Electric equipment is improving rapidly. Autonomous technology is finally starting to work reliably in some applications. The company's traditional customer base in fossil fuel extraction, mining for coal and developing oil fields, faces an uncertain future. Caterpillar's response has been to, well, adapt. They're investing in electric and hybrid technology where it makes sense. They're developing hydrogen fuel cells for some applications. They're working on autonomous mining trucks that can operate 24 hours a day without human operators. They're partnering with tech companies to integrate advanced software into their machines. The company argues that even in a renewable energy future, you still need earth-moving equipment. You need to build wind farms, you need to build solar arrays, you need to mine lithium and cobalt for batteries, you need to construct new electrical infrastructure. All of that requires bulldozers and excavators and haul trucks. They're probably right. The demand for earth-moving might shift from one type of project to another, but it's not going away. Caterpillar's challenge is to make sure their equipment remains the first choice for whatever projects customers are undertaking in 2030 or 2040 or 2050. The company's culture has evolved too. The aggressive, almost combative approach to labor relations from the 1990s has softened somewhat. Caterpillar still operates non-union plants and pushes hard on productivity, but the outright hostility has faded. They've had to compete for talent in a tight labor market, which means treating employees better. There's also a recognition that the old model of centralized engineering in Peoria, centralized manufacturing in a few large plants, and then shipping equipment around the world doesn't work as well in the modern economy. Caterpillar has shifted toward regional R&D centers, regional manufacturing, and regional supply chains. It's more expensive in some ways, but it's more resilient and more responsive to local customer needs. Looking back at the company's 100-year history, the continuity is kind of remarkable. The fundamental product, a tracked vehicle for moving across soft ground, hasn't changed that much conceptually since 1904. Benjamin Holt would recognize a modern Cat bulldozer. He'd be amazed by the technology, the hydraulics, the electronics, the emissions controls, but he'd understand what it was and what it was for. The company that bears his Caterpillar name has outlasted almost every competitor from the early days. Best is gone, absorbed in the merger that created Caterpillar. Holt Manufacturing is gone, same reason. International Harvester is gone, broken up and sold off in the 1980s. Alice Chalsters is gone. Even John Deere, which is still around, never achieved Caterpillar's dominance in heavy construction equipment. Komatsu survives and thrives as the perpetual number 2. Volvo competes strongly in certain segments. Hyundai and Doosan from Korea have captured market share in some regions. Chinese manufacturers like Sanya and XCMG are growing fast, but Caterpillar remains the leader, the brand that contractors think of first when they need heavy equipment. That success didn't come from being the nicest company or the most innovative or the most worker-friendly. It came from ruthless focus on the fundamentals: build reliable machines, support them with the best dealer network in the industry, and protect that dealer network at all costs. It came from being willing to make brutal decisions, laying off thousands of workers when times were tough, breaking unions when necessary, closing plants, and cutting costs. It also came from genuine engineering excellence. Caterpillar's diesel engines really are exceptionally durable. Their hydraulic systems really do work better than most competitors. Their machines really do hold their resale value better than most. That stuff matters. If you're building anything anywhere in the world, roads, buildings, dams, mines, pipelines, if you need to move earth on a large scale, you're probably going to call a Caterpillar dealer. That machine that shows up, bright yellow, emblazoned with the Cat logo, it's the direct descendant of that weird wooden-tracked contraption Benjamin Holt tested in a California field on Thanksgiving Day in 1904. The machine that crawled like a caterpillar turned into the company that moves the world. And 120 years later, they're still doing it.